Okay, welcome everybody to this webinar hosted by IDS in Brighton. My name is Richard Burge. I'm an Associate Director at Itad, which is a consultancy firm working in monitoring, evaluation and learning and strategy support to our clients, which range from governments, UN and foundations. We have a very close association with IDS through the Centre for Development Impact and through a number of research programs, including one that I'm working on. I will be presenting for about 35 to 45 minutes. I've got quite a few slides to go through. They have been designed to act as both a resource for SDC staff and their partners, and also to be used in this webinar. So there's quite a lot of material there, which I thought would be of use and useful for you. There'll be a 5-minute break after I've been speaking, and then there'll be a question and answer session. If you can send questions via chat instant messaging, then they'll be picked up and we'll go through those within our break, and then I'll respond afterwards in the next session after the break. The webinar will be recorded and it will be available online shortly after I've done this. So welcome to rather sunny Britain and Brighton, where it's always sunny down here. And I'm going to be talking about adaptive programming and Itad's understanding and experience of adaptive programming. So there are 4 parts to the presentation. Firstly is some kind of introductory remarks, some personal thoughts on adaptive programming. Secondly, I'm going to go through a whole series of slides and examples on adaptive programming that I'm familiar with and that Itad and others are working on. And then I will talk a little bit about, as a third session, Itad's direct experience of adaptive programming and how we approach it as a monitoring, evaluation and learning company. And then, as I said, there'll be a break and some questions and answers after the break. So adaptive programming, some initial thoughts and introduction. So these are my own personal thoughts. So adaptive programming we hear as kind of flavour of the month, particularly in governance work. It's now commonplace. Everybody's talking about it in governance. It's also cutting across different sectors. So I'm also aware of it being used in health programming, in private sector development, impact investing, working in fragile and conflict affected states, for example. My own experience is in governance. I've worked in governance both for government, UK government, and for civil society, and now as a consultant for the last 25 years. So that's what I'm bringing to this webinar, that experience. It's not necessarily new. Some people say, well, this looks like it's things we've been using before, but I think it is, in terms of us allowing us to package things and frame things differently. It gives a kind of a cohesive whole to how we're looking at things, and I think it is a different approach. It's a different mindset, and it is bringing in resources in a different way than before. And I'll be covering all of those issues in my slides. So in a way, though, we can see it as an evolution from things like people would talk about drivers from change in the past, issue-based approaches. It's also used in conjunction with, sometimes blurred, with other approaches. And those other approaches inform our description of adaptive programming. And I say our, this is Itad's description. So those other approaches, you may have heard of problem-driven iterative adaptation, which comes very much from Harvard University. You may have heard of doing development differently, which comes from Harvard, ODI and others. So it's bringing in a number of approaches, a number of kind of people thinking in these areas. But I think all of them share 4 key principles. Firstly, it's about identifying particular problems. Now I'm thinking of more around governance work, so particular problems of institutional reform, for example, or particular problems around rights and human rights, and in particular contexts. Secondly, it focuses on local ownership and it focuses on collective action, and it focuses on bringing together different actors from different areas, be it civil society, academia, private sector, government, both donors and national governments, host governments. A third element is experimentation and being prepared to fail and being investing in failure, and actually seeing failure not as a negative but in a positive if you learn properly from it and you can adapt from it. And so that comes into the fourth principle, which for me is at the heart of it, which is learning at the heart and adaptation and adapting from your learning. So by following these principles, development interventions are thought to be more effective. There's a lot of literature now which is coming out. There's a lot of papers which are being written in terms of the theory and the practice behind it. I think there are also some gaps in the research as well. But adaptive programming is a direct response to an emerging body of evidence. It's suggesting that development is complex, it is context specific, it is non-linear, it is political, and that conventional development of interventions too often fail to take these elements into account. I just thought it would be worth making a distinction between problem-driven iterative adaptation and adaptive programming. Problem-driven, they are used kind of side by side by quite a lot of people. I've used both of them in the design of an adaptive program, which I'll come on to. But I just thought it'd be useful to have a distinction between the two. So problem-driven iterative adaptation, which I said comes originally from Harvard University, is driven by four principles. So firstly, it focuses on locally identified problems. So it's a problem-focused approach. Secondly, it seeks to create an authorizing environment. So it seeks to create those who are actually prepared to encourage what's called positive deviance. So it's prepared to encourage experimentation. Thirdly, and this is a vital part because it's in terms of resourcing, it embeds in this experimentation tight feedback loops. So it really focuses on where feedback is coming, where they can be learning through the course of doing a development programming, and how that learning can actually, that feedback can inform learning and then can adapt a program. And fourthly, it actively encourages a broad set of actors, which I've mentioned about in terms of collective action, for example. So it actually encourages people to work with other people, other actors they may not have necessarily worked with in the past, and encourages engagement rather than confrontation. In terms of adaptive programming, I've just brought up two kind of examples there, which I think resonate very well with adaptive programming. One of which comes from ODI, where it says adaptive programming suggests at a minimum that development actors react and respond to changes in the political and social economic operating environment. So it's about responding to the context, knowing that the context changes, which is a given, which sounds kind of common sense, but actually how do you adapt to it? How do you change both immediately and also in your program? And I will come into some examples on that later. And then the second kind of quote I brought from here is from my own company. Adaptive programming means that activities and outputs will change over the life of the program. So you may not actually know exactly what you're going to deliver. You've got an idea of what you're going to deliver, but you know that that your course of direction is you've got a vision for your direction of travel for the program, but you know that the results may change over time. The benefits of adaptive programming. So people talk a lot about the benefits of adaptive programming. Why do we begin with a problem? Well, we begin with a problem rather than a solution, as it's seen as the most direct way of redressing the bias of externally prescribed solutions, especially to state capability gaps and performance issues. So it's actually saying we're focusing on the problem that needs to be addressed, rather than say we think that we have the solution, which comes from an external source, and sometimes from the north rather than the south. Why is it necessary to iterate? It is necessary to iterate because We need to measure whether the problem is being solved and ensure that we learn continuously in a way that informs programming and the reform process as we go along. So we're continuously reflecting, doing, doing and learning, reflecting, doing and learning. Why are multiple agents involved in the process? Because as I've said, it's a different way of doing development. It's actually looking at different actors. It's being very true to the context. It's being realistic. It's understanding that there are a whole range of actors involved. But how do we know adaptive programming is making a difference? There's a lot of literature out there. The evidence, though, is not always vast. And actually, one of the programs that I'm involved in with IDS is looking at adaptive programming and how it actually is implemented by what we call frontline workers. So by implementers, by donors in the field. So I think this is why it appeals to SDC, which is looking at these issues and saying, so how do we actually make this real? What kind of changes do we make as a donor and actually supporting practitioners in the field? So the second part of this presentation is going to be bringing in some of the learning that we've already had on seen on adaptive programming. I've tried to tailor it for donors and practitioners, so it's relevant to this audience, to SDC. And I'm bringing in learning from a range of programs, primarily in the governance field. So the examples I'm bringing in are from a couple of large-scale UK government-funded programs in Nigeria called Savvy and Pearl. There's more detail in the slides on what they actually stand for. Then there's another one which is called Pyoe Pin in Myanmar, which is a long-term governance program. It's seen as an adaptive program. Then there's the DGF, stands for the Democratic Governance Facility in Uganda. And I brought this one in because I was involved in both the evaluation and design of it. It is a multi-donor program. So there are 8 donors who are funding this program. It's not just DFID, but actually it's the European Union, it's NORAD, it's the NIDA, for example. So it's a whole range of donors funding that. And there's one in Tanzania, which is relatively new, but building on very much an adaptive program called Institutions for Inclusive Development, I4ID. And then I brought in the research program that we're doing as Itad with IDS, with Oxfam and with others, which is called Action for Empowerment Accountability. So I'll be bringing in some examples from that. It's very, very current research. So I've got basically 9 lessons which I've learned from adaptive programming that I would like to bring in. So the first is ensure that you embed learning at the heart of programming. Ensure that the learning informs decision making so that you learn and adapt. You produce accessible and relevant knowledge to support decision making with a focus on effective performance to deliver better results. So the whole idea is that you ensure that you've got the learning embedded both within the program, in what you're funding, and also people's thinking, so that they're actually informing decision making on what the program is going to be intervening over the course of time. So it's prepared to adapt. So that secondly, that you're capturing the knowledge, that you're actually looking at the knowledge that you're gathering, and that you're actually systematically recording it and then actually bringing it back into programming. And that you're testing and refining approaches. Be prepared to experiment, be prepared to fail. And that you're learning and documenting. This is time consuming. It does require a discipline of people documenting their learning, thinking about how they adapt their programs, how they would change an intervention, which they might think is not working, but they might actually say, well, actually now we can be funding something else. The flip side is that old habits die hard. It's actually sometimes very difficult to change mindsets. There is a challenge of sustaining learning. It might be very good at the design stage, but it's actually sometimes very difficult to sustain it. You also need to get the right people. And I'll be touching on all of those three elements in a moment. An example here, I'm not going to go through it in detail, but this is just to give you a diagram, to give you a model of how knowledge management is captured in a development, in an adaptive program. It comes from a current program in Nigeria called Pyoe, and this is one element, which is about accountable and responsive capability. So it's about the supply side of governments. And so this diagram shows how knowledge is identified, how knowledge is captured, how knowledge is stored, and then what do you do with that knowledge? Do you actually then think about your intervention and you adapt? And how do you actually share that knowledge? How do you collaborate? So secondly, my second learning point from adaptive programming is a need to devolve decision-making and accountability. You need to give frontline staff the scope and authority to own the principles in practice, so that they actually own those principles of adaptive programming that I covered. You need to be able to promote devolved decision-making, which filters down to key posts and at local level. In Nigeria, that's where the state level parts of the program actually have that accountability. They know that they're accountable to the donor, but they also have the freedom then to operate and to adapt in the way that, that follows the principles. Ensure then that there is downward accountability, so that there is downward accountability to the communities they're working to. So there is that kind of mutual process between the practitioner and the beneficiary communities. We've also found, and this is an example of our work, recent research that we've done in Myanmar, which has been led by Itad and Oxfam, and two of my colleagues, Angela Christie from Itad and Duncan Green from Oxfam. What they found is adaptive programs are easy to get into. It's quite easy to design them. It's quite easy to build that space and that flexibility, but they can be hard to drop. And they can be hard to drop because relationships build, and sometimes it's hard to drop that relationship, or a relationship with a civil society organisation that you want to work with, for example, on adaptive programming. In an area of governance, it could be around implementation of a law on domestic violence, for example, or it could be about freedom of information. But you're working on that relationship, and it allows you to be both a convener and broker, but it also can actually be, it can also kind of stymie kind of when you want to actually say, well, we've achieved as much there, or we're not going to achieve no more, then we're going to kind of adapt. And how do you then change that relationship? Being adaptive makes upward accountability harder, so it makes it more challenging for the donor to accept adaptive programming, because they know that the accountability is more difficult. Donors do demand due diligence, and rightly so. And it also depends on the donor's risk appetite for failure and experimentation. Third learning point is be politically smart. You need to be politically smart in adaptive programs. You need to understand the power and power structures. You need to think and act politically. So it involves knowing what people, getting the right people to work in a political way. It does, if you're looking at institutional reform, so you're looking at reform of the health sector, for example, or the education sector, or public financial management, it's going with the grain. So it's actually working with the government that's trying to bring in that institutional reform. But at the same time, you might be wanting to challenge social norms. There might be some social norms, particularly around gender or corruption, for example, where social norms are very prevalent. So you need to work within a reform process, identifying windows of opportunity, identifying those champions for reform who you want to work with, who are able to work with and got capable to working with other actors. And process matters. Building trust and collaboration is important in themselves. The process is sometimes as important as the outcomes. But there are limits and risks of being political. and there are risks of going with the grain when you think it might be supporting entrenched interests at the expense of others, more vulnerable, more marginalised people. So some examples of being politically smart. An example comes from a program in Nigeria called ARC. And this is a program which is supporting relevant partnerships with governments to actively engage in facilitating and delivering reform, so addressing key issues and processes. They're learning and sharing through the process. ARC is designed to drive three important aspects of reform. Firstly, to deepen and reinforce change support service delivery aims, particularly in health and education. Secondly, to embed change to ensure sustainability. Thirdly, to broaden or extend change from what's called, this is jargon, islands of success. So to replicate with other states and ministries in Nigeria, for example. It employs a problem-driven methodology. So it's looking at problems to solve and problems to solve with collective action, engaging with government. And those problems emerge through discussion, dialogue with those actors. They say, these are the problems that we want to solve. And it's so there's a need to understand political economy and the extent that behaviour change is required. And that is critical. We are talking, if it's to do with anti-corruption, for example, where you want to bring in anti-corruption measures, both in tackling grand corruption and petty corruption, which is very prevalent in Nigeria, you are talking about behaviour change. You're talking about a change in social norms. Fourth learning point for adaptive programming is they need to be locally led and, as I've said previously, to support coalitions. They need to learn from partnership-based approaches. Having worked for a civil society organisation for 10 years, in my formative years, I know that partnership-based approaches are very prevalent and very kind of key to civil society. But that doesn't mean to say you continue with those partnerships throughout. It's partnerships around a specific problem. And as I've said previously, it embraces downward accountability. There are risks of being captured, and you could be captured by government, civil society, private sector. And when I say captured, the issue that you're working on could be very pertinent to that actor, to that civil society organisation, but is that dealing with the problem? Is that what you really want to address? You need to get right people in the room, so you need to think about who you're getting, who you're working with. You need to avoid, and this is an SDG, of leaving no one behind. So it's very challenging, getting the right people in the room as well as leaving no one behind. And how do you defend relationship building when it's not clear what those relationships will yield? You might not know what it will yield, bringing people together for the first time. An example from Pyoe Pin in Myanmar. Pyoe Pin is an innovative governance program. It's been going for for over 10 years now. It achieves lasting benefits for citizens. It's promoting new incentives for collective political and government and citizen action. One of the examples that we looked at as an issue-based problem was around the fisheries industry. How do you actually make the fisheries industry in Myanmar much more responsive to the fishing communities so that they actually make more of an economic gain, it's more sustainable? So who do you work with? And in this case, you work with civil society, you work with local government, you work with the ministry to dealing with fisheries, and you also work with the fisherfolk themselves. So there's some really good evidence coming out from Pyoe Pin where that collective action is actually achieving something, both in terms of legislation, in terms of policy, and in terms of economic gains. And so Pyoe Pin works through local partners in the examples I've given. I've just given a kind of a map which shows those, or a diagram to show those different actors coming together. Another example is from Tanzania. This has a theory of change behind it. I won't go through this theory of change in detail, but this is a program which has been up and running for about 1.5 years, nearly 2 years now. And this is all around, the focus is around collective action. it's got its principles of adaptive program are embedded in it. And it's all about having multi-stakeholder approaches, multi-level coalitions. And the initial efforts which I've seen is where they've been looking at, they're doing political economy analysis around specific areas of agricultural production, about road maintenance, about road building, and they're looking at those specific areas about who actually is involved in this and can they bring actors together. And that is also, the outcomes are focused around changing policy and practice, but also looking at the economic gains by different communities. A fifth learning to come from the literature is build, plan, and resource at the outset. So you need to invest in adaptive programming and management at the design stage. You need to be serious about it. You need to provide those resources. You need to budget and profile throughout the implementation. So you need to have points where you're going to reflect, points where you're going to learn. You need to think about how your results framework is developed and how results framework can be adaptive. So you might set a number of indicators which are your core indicators, and you might have those as variable indicators as well. And we've seen evidence where that does work in some of the Nigeria work. But you need to build in the flexibility. So you need to be able to, at times in the programming and in your results framework, to reflect and then to adapt. You need to change the spending. You need to change the activities. The questions to donors are procurement processes able to be adaptive? And what we're finding that there's a problem with, you can design an adaptive program, but procurement procedures may not actually allow that adaptation. So there's a challenge there. So can donors build in adaptation into their contracting? And how do you square adaptive programming with a payment by results and milestones-based payments? So how do you actually ensure you have an adaptive program which is not strangled or stymied by payment by results? An example is one which I led a team to, firstly, to evaluate the democratic governance facility in Uganda. So I said this is a multi-donor program, and then to design it. And this is a program which was designed to be politically smart. So you do ongoing political analysis. You're expecting your leaders in the practitioner to be thinking politically, to be acting politically. It needs to be built as an adaptive program. So with all of those principles, those 4 principles that I mentioned, it needs to be able to build new partnership, which is one of those principles, and engage a broad set of actors. And it was also designed to be proactive, so that the actual body which was implementing this, which was employed by the donors, so a body of about 35 individuals, that they were acting as a change agent. They were a facilitator, a convener for others. So they were actively engaged, but they were facilitating, convening others to come together and ensuring that, when I say others, local government in Uganda, civil society in Uganda, community-based groups, certain social movements where there was a space for social movements to operate, and private sector and academia, that the DGF was creating that space so that they would actually work together and that they would actually have that space. And so fund meetings, fund workshops, actually fund exchange visits between different parties. I won't go through this in detail, but when we were designing this, we thought, what would it look like in practice? So these are some practical examples where we thought about the principles, and I've put PDIA principles, same as adaptive program principles in my view in this particular case. So we looked at the principles and we thought about how this would look within a Uganda context. So I'll share that with you. You can look at it in the recorded version of this webinar. We also looked at what are the key risks. So there's a number of risks here, both the contextual risks. Is there the appetite with the government of Uganda for this way of working? when there is a concern about the closing of civic space, that there are a number of risks for civil society as well. Civil society may have limited interest. There are risks around who is represented by the civil society. How does civil society represent communities in Uganda? Risks around political will to undertake, for example, pro-gender equality and human rights legislative reforms, which is at the heart of the democratic governance facility. So there are two areas which were very, very strong for the democratic governance facility, but is there the political will to actually push through legislation if you're wanting to work with parliament, political parties and civil society who are demanding rights around gender and human rights? And then there are also programmatic risks as well, which we identified. But if you're designing an adaptive programming as SDC, then you might want to think about, are these risks relevant for your program? How do you actually get traction? How do you actually address those risks? How do you mitigate against those risks? Then a sixth learning point is embed political economy analysis. But do political economy analysis which is in a way that is relevant, which is specific, not an all-encompassing political economy analysis which is done at a high technical level, but one which is relevant to the problem that you're trying to address. It might be around issues around phishing, it could be issues around gender equality, it could be issues around budget transparency, it could be issues around combating petty corruption, for example. Make sure that the political economy analysis is done specifically on that area and get the right people in the room. And also political economy analysis should be done in a continuous way, a more strategic way. So it shouldn't be just something, right, we've done that now, put that on the shelf, we've done it, it's informed the design of that activity, of that intervention. Revisit it, think how relevant it remains, think about the gaps that may have been created. And I've just brought in a few examples on political economy analysis coming out of our recent research on Myanmar from Pyoe Pin, which is very much an adaptive program. We saw the donor and the practitioner on this adaptive programming were actually doing political economy analysis in two ways. They were actually doing what we call everyday political economy analysis. So it was continuous. They were doing it on a day-to-day basis. They were continuously navigating the kind of the complexity of working in Myanmar and with the Myanmar government and the changes in the government. They were working to an extent on instinct. They were generating what they thought were best guesses, and they were testing and correcting on what we called, or what our research called, dancing with the system. So they were continuously dancing with the system, with the governance system. And then a second kind of doing political economy analysis is in a much more strategic way. It was more deliberate, more conscious. It was actually standing back, acting as a critical friend and saying, okay, we've reflected on our support to this area, say fisheries, for example, or agriculture. And actually we've stepped back and we said, enough is enough. We can't do anything more on this, we can't change anything more on this, or we've got to change our tack, we've got to change the activities that we're doing, or bring in new actors. We may have forgot the private sector. We may have neglected certain people in government. And then another example is from I4ID Tanzania. And this is just an overview. This is thinking about, this is the bigger picture, and then you would drill down and be more specific. But the bigger picture talks on this, and this is how I4ID was designed. It looked at the political settlement in Tanzania. It looked at the formal and informal institutional arrangements. It looked at privileges, patronage networks, democratic institutions, electoral politics, transparency issues, anti-corruption issues. Point 7, so my 7th learning lesson, is getting the right people. And we saw this very much in Pyoe Pin. We've seen it in Nigeria, we've seen it in Tanzania, and in Uganda. In all of the cases, this is critical. You need to recruit and invest in getting the right people. You need to put an emphasis on soft skills, things like emotional intelligence. You need to think about competencies, attitudes, behaviours, people who can work politically with a small p, not a big P. You need to be prepared to work with different actors. You need to allow people to dance, which is an example from Pyoe Pin in Myanmar. And you need to invest in mentoring and shadowing. It's not just providing good technical skills, it's also knowing how to work with people, how to inspire them, how to motivate them, how to empower them, how to give them the space to operate. And it takes time to recruit the right people. And it can be hard to retrain people who've gone from one program which was not adaptive into another stage, like the Democratic Governance Facility in Uganda, which has become an adaptive programming. It can be hard to retrain the people who stayed in that program. Have you got the right people? You might need to make some hard decisions. My penultimate point is you need to be prepared to fail. You need to fail fast and learn from that failure. You need to avoid going for the quick wins. One program I looked at, the donor was concerned that the implementer, the service provider on an adaptive program was going for the quick wins because they were concerned about the milestone payment, where actually what they were really wanting the practitioner, the service provider to go for was the more difficult things to achieve. But actually, if you could actually achieve collective action around a certain problem, which was seen as more challenging in Tanzania, then that would be a greater win in the long run. And you need to experiment. You need to demonstrate your experimentation as well and record that experimentation. So there are concerns about donors' appetite to spend money on failure. We know it very much in the UK, that is a concern. And also, how do you know if an effort is worth continuing? How do you know when to stop? How do you know when something is off track and you just say, we'll stop funding that area of intervention? And finally, kind of bringing all of these lessons together really is a direction of travel, is supporting the strategic direction of travel, is actually saying we're going to support this process. Adaptive programming is a process and we're prepared to support this because we believe we've got everything lined up appropriately. And in a way, this is what we learned from Myanmar, it is a compass, not a map. And things do change. But it's not saying we're not asking for a blank check as a practitioner of adaptive programming. But there is accountability, but it's accountability done in a different way. So it's less rigid on predefined results and outcomes, but having, as I've said previously, having a basket of indicators. Some are bedrock indicators, so some which you want to have indicators for success. So what you clearly think will happen, but probably more broader, and then others which are variable, the more specific indicators. And I'll be coming on to a number of those in the final slides in a moment. So I've brought in a few examples here of that support to a direction of travel, placing learning at the centre. It comes from work that we as Itad are doing with a programme called Empowering Citizens Pillar, which is part of a wider programme in Nigeria. And I've brought in some slides, I won't go in detail, but I've brought in some slides where it's the model that we've introduced and working with the practitioners is called Learning and Adaptive Management Process and Systems. It's called LAMPS for short. And you can see with the diagram, there's every 3 to 6 months, there's learning, there's reflection. And then what do? You actually adapt, you scale up, or you stop. So it's kind of like a traffic light system. So from your learning, you say, right, we'll continue doing that intervention, we'll continue funding, for example, public financial management or fisheries sector, or you adapt. You actually change who you're working with or how you're working, but you're still working in that area. Or you say, actually, we'll stop doing this because we think we've gone far enough, or we're failing in this area, and therefore we're going to learn from it, but we're going to stop working on it. So the next slide is just showing some examples from that work about how we ensure accountability and enable adaptability. So we're trying to do this, the things at the same time. We're not ignoring accountability. And the last of that set of slides around that approach will just give you some of the challenges, some of the learning at the operational level that we've identified. So I brought in 5 examples there. From our research, we feel that there remain gaps in the evidence on adaptive programming. So a lot of people work in adaptive programming. The research, though, is varied. The research is a bit scant. What we're looking at in this work that we're doing with IDS and with Oxfam and ourselves as Itad, we're looking at 3 questions. One, we're looking at how does an adaptive approach to programming and program management work in uncertain and volatile contexts? Secondly, what are the adaptive mechanisms and strategies for supporting social and political and economic inclusion? And thirdly, does adaptive programming enable external actors such as SDC to achieve better empowerment outcomes? So this is the research that we're doing. Duncan Green's been blogging about it because he's one of our researchers on it, and we're doing work and which will be linked to our website at Itad and also at IDS. Very finally, just very briefly, this is Itad's experience. That what Itad brings this, and we work in a number of areas. What does Itad bring to adaptive programming? We bring high quality evidence. We learn from that evidence. We analyze it and we learn. We innovate. We adapt as a monitoring, evaluation and learning provider, and we communicate. So I've just got a few slides which have a few points on what we do with evidence, that we generate evidence, informs our analysis. So we're generating evidence from adaptive programming and we're analysing it. We're looking at what's working and what's not working so well. We're learning. We're learning in different ways. We're learning as a strategy learning partner, we're doing monitor and evaluation partner, and we're doing independent evaluations. And we're looking at we work in a number of sectors, not just governance, which is my sector. We're innovating. So we, as the monitor and evaluation learning provider, we are engaged, we're understanding the complexity of design. We're trying to be political by nature ourselves, and we're responding to an ever-changing environment. We're avoiding off-the-shelf methods and tools. We're always creating methods and tools which are pertinent to the program, be it theory of change, use of contribution analysis, political access and influence measurement framework, our gender equality framework, which is based on self, society, and institutions. We're adapting. We are thinking and working politically ourselves. We're managing the tensions between adaptive programming and donors' results agendas. And we're also communicating. We're being utilisation focused. We're acting as a critical friend, a challenge function, and we're recognising telling the story is not always easy given the process and demands. It's not always easy to tell the story about adaptive programs. I won't go through this slide, but that's just about how Itad helps clients to achieve their challenges in adaptive programming. And now it's over to you guys. We're going to break, as I said, for 5 minutes. We're going to take any questions that are coming our way or coming my way, and then we'll see about addressing them. Thank you very much for listening, and over to you.